Good morning. Thank you for your lively interest in this debate this morning. Let me present to you Professor Josef ZWEIMELLER from Zurich. My name is Tobias Piller. I'm a German journalist. Professor ZWEIMELLER is Austrian, and he's been a director of the London-based Center of Economic Policy Research, CPR. And this is a place which does economic research related to the labor market. So he is working on the labor market, on the welfare state, and on the relationship greatly between labor market and the voting of citizens. This should be an interesting topic to us because there is the question of globalization, which also moves economies not only in Europe but all over the world. And then at the same point gives you a lot of migration, and the migration again starts to have political effects. If you have a quick look at numbers in Europe, you will find that between 2010 and 2018, in only 9 years, we had 6 million applications for political asylum, and these were not people only who had the right to asylum, but who were also migrants. So that is a bit more than 1% of the European population. Germany had 2.1 million applications in 9 years, 2.6% of the population. Italy, a little bit less, only 0.7%. It's a bit less than 500,000. But if you look at places like Malta, you can see also certain pressure on the population because they had 27,000 applications for asylum, but in relation to their population, that is a lot. It's nearly 6% of their population. So if you send only a few hundred people to Malta, it has a big effect. The question is, why do we have in some European states some real strong political reaction, and why do we have less reactions in states that even have a lot of immigration or a lot of asylum applications? So we are interested to hear Professor ZWEIMELLER on this. Please let me say something organizational. There are some kind ladies in an orange T-shirt who have agreed that they will be so kind to bring written questions to me. So while you listen to Professor ZWEIMELLER, you can already write a question in English or in Italian to me, and I will then present the questions to Professor ZWEIMELLER, either right in the middle if there is something really urgent, or at the end of his presentation. So please refer to the lady in the orange T-shirt who's got some paper with her and who will bring the questions to me. Thank you. Professor ZWEIMELLER, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to present on globalization and the rise of right-wing parties and the fall of social democracy. So if you look at empirical evidence, we all know that right-wing populism is on the rise in Europe. And when I talk about Europe now, I will mostly talk about Western Europe, by which I mean 16 European countries, EU's 15 minus Greece, plus Switzerland and Norway. So these 16 countries comprise a population of roughly 400 million inhabitants, and somewhat more than 210 million individuals have voted in the last elections. Of these 210 plus million, more than 25 or around 25 million have voted for right-wing populist parties in the recent election. At the same time, what we see is a collapse of social democracy. So back in the late 1990s, more than 70 million have voted for social democrats in the last election. By the year 2018, this has gone down to 45 million. So you see a really tectonic shift in the political landscape in Western Europe. And we're talking a lot about this. And mainly there are two important perspectives that I want to mention here. One mentions that there are traditional values and identity as one important drivers, in the sense that elites have pushed liberal rights too far, focused on gender equality, gay rights, ethnic diversity, and environmental protection, and so on. And this is not really kind of in the interest, or maybe also against the will of ordinary people. And the second main perspective would be the economic perspective, about which I will be talking mostly today. This says that globalization has produced winners and losers, and there's an increasing divide between those who are left behind and those who benefit from the globalization process. And importantly, the number of people who fear to be left behind is growing. So both views are, of course, important and relevant. But in this lecture, after all, we are in the Festival of Economics, I will talk about the economic perspective. Let me just mention results from a recent survey. There are many such surveys. This is just an example that just makes clear that globalization is really felt as a threat by many individuals. This was conducted by the Bertelsmann Foundation, an August 2016 survey. And in the EU 28, 45% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed to this statement. There's, of course, variation across countries, but what is very clear from this survey is that the right-wing voters, say the AfD voters from Western Germany, or Lega Nord in Italy, they disproportionately would support and agree with this statement. Similarly, if you ask individuals, are your current economic prospects have become worse, or is your future economic outlook bad, then a substantial fraction of individuals would agree or strongly agree to this statement. Again, a disproportional agreement among right-wing voters. Now, the evidence suggests that indeed globalization is considered a threat, and a threat that is associated with economic outlooks that look bad for many individuals, in particular for the less educated, for blue-collar workers, for older individuals, for males. Now, in this lecture, I want to address the question, did globalization affect voting? And in economics, we have a kind of a workhorse model that can explain why globalization produces winners and losers. So I will be focusing on two main aspects of the globalization process, which is immigration and trade. And the outline of the talk will be that I first will review existing empirical evidence, and then I will also show you some preliminary evidence from an ongoing project where we study this question. And actually, when Tito Boeri was inviting me to present a year ago, I was very optimistic and hoped that I will be able to present only about my ongoing project. But unfortunately, this has turned out to be much more complicated to put all data together. But I think I have something to say, and I hope that you will have many comments about it. So let me very, very briefly say about what a standard model of economics would say about the winners and losers of globalization. This would be about the labor market, where we have high and low skilled workers. In the equilibrium on this labor market, productivity and wages would be aligned, so high skilled workers get well paid, low skilled workers get low wages, and the employment prospects of the low skilled workers would be worse than the employment prospects of the high skilled. And we can look now at this framework how immigration would affect the labor market. So if immigrants are disproportionately low skilled, and this is actually what is going on in most countries, not in all countries, but in most countries in Western Europe, then what this implies is the relative supply of low-skilled workers increases, the low-skilled labor force becomes increasingly abundant, there will be a pressure on wages, and for low-skilled native workers, this means that they face higher competition on the labor market and worse labor market outcomes. Similarly, when we look at international trade, international trade has substantially increased in part due to increases of imports from low-income countries that have typically a low skill intensity, then this means that the relative demand for low-skilled workers decreases. So domestic firms face fierce competition, which means that low-skilled jobs become increasingly destroyed, which leads to the decline of the manufacturing sector. Now, this is the theory. What does the evidence tell us? Okay, this model works quite well. It can explain wage inequality, what we see in the data. The skill premium, the difference between high and low-skilled wages is increasing in many countries, and we have a persistent gap in employment opportunities between the high and the low-skilled. Now, if we think about what happens if there is immigration, what is the empirical effect of immigration on labor market outcomes, so interestingly, we see that there is no clear evidence of immigration on labor market outcomes of native workers. This may be surprising, but actually empirical economists have a hard time to establish such a relationship. And this is different from what empirical research has documented with respect to imports from low-income countries, where we see clearly a detrimental labor market impact of imports and manufacturing employment. So one important paper to which I will refer later on, once again, is the famous China shock paper by David Autor and co-authors. Okay? Now, this brings me to the first question. What does the literature tell us about the effect of immigration on the rise of right-wing parties? I mentioned the labor market effects, and through which immigration may affect voting behavior, but of course not only labor market considerations, but many other considerations are relevant. There's a long literature in political science and sociology that, for instance, emphasized the collective threat hypothesis that would say that in increasing immigration should increase the support for right-wing parties because an increasing immigrant group may challenging the natives' economic, social, and cultural dominance. There's also the contact hypothesis that goes in the opposite direction, that essentially says that if there's more intergroup interaction, then prejudices of the majority against the minority might decrease, which actually would destroy any impact of immigration on anti-immigration sentiment. So let's look at the empirical evidence. And I want to show you some studies that have been conducted recently. And these are single country studies. And let me study with Austria, where I come from and where I have done research on my own. So this is a recent from the recent election campaign. You see the Austrian former FPÖ party leader, whom you all know has had to resign after the recent scandal. And this shows you very clearly that in the recent election campaign, the FPÖ took a very strong stance against immigration, but this has been so from the mid-1980s, when Jörg Haider took over the party. So this is here what we see is a time series of the immigrant share in Austria over the period of the early 1960s up until the year 2011. And you see that in the mid-80s, from the mid-80s until the early 90s, immigration was very strongly increasing, and this coincided with the asylum wave from after the breakdown of former Yugoslavia. And at the same time, votes for the FPÖ were, during that period, very strongly increasing. Okay? Now, what we do in an empirical research paper, we study the question whether high immigration locations within Austria did indeed gain more vote support, whether the FPÖ did indeed get a lot of support from voters. And what we exploit here in this research is that there's a huge variation in the immigrant share across locations. So if you look at the 2011 census, then the average immigrant share in the entire country was somewhat more than 10%. But the standard deviation across locations, and these are municipalities, is an order of magnitude that is almost similar to the mean, is 7.7 percentage points. So we essentially can compare locations that have a high immigrant share, or actually that gained a lot of immigrants, to locations that did not. And we look at 7 national elections. We can look at 2,300 municipalities, and we exploit census data for the various censuses to characterize municipalities in much detail, and also be able to characterize the local voting population. What we find is that local immigration indeed has a significant impact on local FPÖ votes, but actually the impact is not particularly large. We find that a 1 percentage point increase in local immigration leads to a 0.16 percentage point increase in FPÖ votes, which explains something, but not very much, of the regional variation in FPÖ votes, in FPÖ support that we actually see. Okay? The effects that we see is, are consistent with the labor market, with adverse labor market prospects, but also with neighborhood quality, schools, and so on. Of course, what you have to worry about if you do comparison across locations, where the mobility choices may contaminate the effect, because it could be that immigrants avoid locations where there is a lot of anti-immigration sentiments, or it could also be that the native population leaves locations where there's a lot of immigration. Okay? And we make sure that this result that we get is not contaminated by by such mobility choices. Let me briefly say something about a study on Italy, which was conducted about at the same time as ours, and this looked at immigration and support for the Casa della Libertà. This is a study by Barone and co-authors, and as you all remember, the Casa della Libertà comprised at the time the Forza Italia and the Alleanza Nazionale and the Lega Nord, and both of these latter parties were of course strongly opposed against immigrants. They use a similar approach than ours and find a much stronger effect. They actually find that a 1 percentage point increase in local immigration increases vote shares for the Casa della Libertà by 0.86%. Interestingly, they find that the effect is very large in small municipalities, but does not exist in big cities. This is actually a result that many other studies find. It's probably also kind of consistent with many discussions that we have about the rural-urban divide. And they also find that the immigration effect is particularly strong when immigrants are culturally more different, okay? In particular Muslim immigrants. Now the literature here, these were just 2 examples of a growing literature. And the literature actually, the majority of studies, and here I have an incomplete list of recent studies, finds that immigration tends to provide support for right-wing parties. Interestingly, there are 2 recent studies that find support for the contact hypothesis. This is in the context of asylum seekers. They compare municipalities that could provide housing for asylum seekers to other municipalities that did not have housing for asylum seekers. And this comparison shows that locations that housed asylum seekers indeed, in the Austrian case at least, it was that support for FPÖ votes was also increasing, but it was increasing less than it was increasing in municipalities that did not house asylum seekers. Okay, so the literature basically tells us there is the majority of studies does find an impact of immigration on support of right-wing parties. The studies are, though, not very easily comparable for many reasons, and there is certainly a need for comparable cross-country studies so that we can really precisely compare cross-country experiences and also kind of in the next step evaluate effects of immigration policies. This brings me to the second point, namely the question whether international trade has an impact on political preferences. So why should international trade have an impact? Okay? What we see in the empirical data is that the rise of Chinese imports that took place over the last decades was associated with a decline of the manufacturing sector. This shows the US experience is taken from the famous paper by Autodorn and Hansen, the AER 2013, and it shows that the blue line is the rise of Chinese imports is associated over time with the fall of the manufacturing sector. This, what is frequently called the China import shock, actually did strongly affect local labor markets, and local labor markets were actually differentially affected because they were differentially exposed to import competition due to differences in the pre-existing industry structure. And this point is made by the paper by Autodorn and Hansen, which is probably one of the most influential papers in economics that was published over the last years. And they find that the increase in China import penetration explains roughly 1/4 of the decline in US manufacturing. Okay? Now in Western Europe, this is US, and we are talking here about Western Europe, so how are things in Western Europe? So here I have a graph that shows you on the horizontal axis the share of Chinese trade as a fraction of EU 16, of the 16 Western European country GDP, drawn against the share of the manufacturing sector. And also in Europe, you see Chinese imports have increased. They have increased substantially over the period, and this was associated very, very closely to the decline of manufacturing. Now, this is about Chinese trade and how it affected manufacturing employment. So let's look about how did it affect voting behavior. Okay? First, let's again look at US evidence, and here I want to briefly mention one paper by David Otto and co-authors that have used their China shock framework studying voting outcomes. And what they find is actually that the support for the Republican Party is stronger in locations that experienced more increases, a higher increase in Chinese imports. And then they do an interesting counterfactual experiment, a thought experiment, and ask what would have happened to voting outcomes if Chinese import growth would be 50% smaller than it actually was. Okay? And it actually turns out that 3 swing states, namely Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, would actually have elected the Democrat rather than the Republican candidate. And this would have implied that Hillary Clinton, rather than Donald Trump, would have become the US president. Now, this is one piece of evidence, but there's also other recent evidence that goes in the same direction and says that Chinese imports have strongly changed the contributed to this change in the political landscape. How about Europe? We have one interesting study in Europe, actually by 2 Italian colleagues, Calantone and Stanik, that had a paper published in the American Journal of Political Science that looked at 198 Western European regions and a large number of elections since the late 1990s. And what they find is that also in Europe, Chinese imports have an impact on voting behavior. In particular, they find that Chinese imports increase vote shares for nationalist, isolationist, and radical right parties. And the empirical effect is actually quite strong. There are also other studies that go, European studies that go in the same direction. There's one study for Germany, another study for France that find pretty similar effects. So if we summarize the empirical results on import competition and voting, then we can say there's clear evidence that import competition shifts voters towards right-wing political parties. There is a lot of cross-country evidence that, or one caveat may be that the empirical studies for Europe are typically based on a relatively large level of aggregation. These are the NUTS 2 regions according to the European classification, regional classification. So this is something where in our project, about which I will be talking in a minute, I will be trying to improve. And interestingly, the existing studies do not say much about social democracy. And social democracy, as we have seen at the very beginning, has lost many, many votes. And the question is the support for social democratic parties affected by globalization? We also lack, as I mentioned before, systematic cross-country evidence that looks at the combined effect of immigration and import competition. It could be that these two developments reinforce each other or maybe go in the opposite direction. Okay. So this is the third point that I want to talk about in this talk is about globalization and voting behavior in Western Europe. This is a project that I conduct with my Zurich colleague David Dorn. So the main idea of the project is to put together a new data set where we look at a finer regional level of aggregation. So these are not NUTS 2, as previous studies have used, but NUTS 3 regions, one aggregation level deeper. Then a particular focus of our study is the fall of social democracy, which was dramatic since the mid-2000s. And we also want to look simultaneously at immigration and trade and study whether these two variables interact with each other. I also want to mention that all slides and empirical results that I show you now is preliminary. Okay? We have, I'm pretty sure that there is no big mistake in it, but it may, you never know. Okay? So we have, as I mentioned, 16 countries. We have 1,038 regions, and we have 118 elections. And now I will provide some descriptive empirical evidence. First, we look at Western Europe as a whole. Second, we look at country-level evidence. And finally, we can look at regional-level evidence. So let's look first at the trends that we see, globalization and voting, for Western Europe as a whole. Social democrats, if you take the most, we compare early 1990s to the most recent elections, then social democrats are down from 35% in 1990 to 22% in 2018. So this is a very, very strong decline. And right-wing populist parties are up from 2.5% to 10.5% in 2018. So this means that the recent social democrat losses are larger than the right-wing gains. And this change has happened mostly after 2004, as I will show you. Now, let's check how closely these voting trends are linked to the decline of manufacturing employment and to the increase in immigration. And here is a graph that has on the horizontal axis the share of workers in manufacturing. Okay? And the share of manufacturing, if you can read it, has decreased over time. So on the left, we have a high share. On the right, we have a low share. Okay? And what has happened over time is that if you look at the red line, then this shows the vote losses of social democrats since the year 1990. So this is a negative number, but there was not a strong trend up until 2004. Okay? But since 2004, the vote losses increased, and this was associated also with a speed up of the decline in the manufacturing sector, particularly after the financial crisis 2008. Okay? At the same time, we see an increase in right-wing voters, but the striking picture that we see here is that the loss of social democracy is substantially larger than the gain of right-wing parties. Now, another interesting piece of evidence is how are voting trends related to immigration trends. Here you see that there was not a lot of immigration actually back in the 1990s and So there was also not much change in voting behavior, but again, since the mid-2000s, immigration started to increase, and this coincides very closely with the trend, with the downward trend in votes for the Social Democrats. Okay, so this is the picture we get when we look at Europe, Western Europe as a whole. Now let's dig a little deeper and look at 16 countries. Okay, so what we have here is within country variation in the share of immigrants relative to, or plotted against the within country variation in the vote support for Social Democrats. So one data point would say that, let's look at one particular data point. This data point is the 2013 Austrian election. In that election, the immigration was 5 percentage points above the long-run average. At the same time, vote support for the Social Democrats was 5 percentage points below the long-run average. Okay, so this is within country variation. This essentially tells us whenever immigration increases, this tends to be associated with a reduction in the fall of Social Democrat support. Interestingly, if you look at data points before 2004, such a trend did not exist. This is a recent trend that really kicks in after 2005, and this may also explain why so many studies have mainly looked at the right-wing parties and not so much looked at Social Democrats or emphasized the impact on Social Democrats. But recently, this is the point I want to make. It is very clearly visible in the data that these immigration trends affect voting for Social Democrats very strongly. Okay? Now we can do the same thing for the right-wing party, and not surprisingly, we see that there's a positive relationship between increase in immigration and support for right-wing parties. And if we take the two together, then we see that the relationship is stronger among the Social Democrats than it is for the right-wing parties. Okay? Now we can do exactly the same thing, not using immigration as an outcome, but using the decline of the manufacturing sector as an outcome, and we get pretty much the same picture. Okay? Again, if there is manufacturing decline, then Social Democrats lose votes. If there is a manufacturing decline, there's vote gains for the right-wing parties, but the correlation between these two variables is strong among some Social Democrats than it is among the manufacturing decline and right-wing parties. Okay? Now we can do the same thing for China trade. Okay? And we would get a relationship that tells us more imports from China reduces support for Social Democrats. It increases support for right-wing parties. And if you take the two together, we have a strong relationship between both. Again, what the cross-country evidence shows us quite clearly is that social democracy is strongly affected, support for social democracy is strongly affected by the globalization trends. The question is, what happens if we dig even deeper and look at the fine level of regional aggregation? So we look at NUTS 3 regions, and we have in total 1,038 regions. Again, we look at 118 elections over the period 1990 to 2008. Okay? So this is just to show you that we have a relatively fine, high granularity of the regional data. And if you do here, again, the correlation between within region variation in immigration and vote support for Social Democrats and right-wing voters. So these are pinned data points. We have 100 percentiles. Okay? Each data point comprises like 40 or 50 data points. Then we get, again, pretty much the same picture that we saw before. So this is immigration as an outcome. This is manufacturing decline as an outcome. Here, the relationship continues to be strong for Social Democrats and is somewhat weaker for the right-wing parties. Now, finally, what we have not yet done is look at the impact of China import exposure and do the full empirical analysis how this affected voting outcomes. Okay? So this brings me to the conclusions. Okay, so we studied voting behavior in Western Europe. Since 2004, Social Democrats over this period lost 25 million voters. Right-wing populist parties gained 7 million voters in these 16 Western European countries. We find that there's a significant association of globalization as measured by immigration and import competition with voting behavior. Globalization indicators, and this is, I think, is interesting, is more strongly correlated with social democratic losses than it is correlated with right-wing populist party gains. And this actually holds at every level of aggregation that we looked at, namely Western Europe as a whole, across and within the 16 European countries that we have in our data, and also within the more than 1,000 NUTS 3 regions over time. So the more general conclusion is that, of course, it's important to understand conditions under which voting outcomes are affected. The political backlash, after all, is an expression of the dissatisfaction of the population with the status quo, and we want to understand what makes people unhappy. More specifically, what we need to understand is how integration policies may reduce support for anti-immigration sentiment and anti-immigration platforms, and also which redistributive policies are needed to address the economic problems that arise from globalization. And after all, if you think about the economics, then economists often advocate free trade precisely because free trade can be a Pareto improving situation, making the average individual better off. And if we appropriately redistribute, then we do not need to have losers. But actually, this does not take place, and a lot of people actually have lost from the globalization, were losers of the globalization process. Of course, another question that arises from our research is what is precisely the reason why social democratic losses were so strong over the recent 10 to 15 years, and particularly why are they so closely associated with globalization trends. One reason, this is just speculation, may be that many social democratic parties have an internal conflict how to cope with globalization. The immigration the question is one of these questions, but also how should you deal with globalization in general? Think about the Brexit and the Labour Party. Then another important evolution, of course, is that traditionally blue-collar workers in the manufacturing were the typical social democratic voters, and this voting base erodes. Okay? Actually, a recent interesting paper by Thomas Piketty also documents that social democratic voters have increasingly been supported by the educational elite. Okay? So this is something that happens in France, but Piketty shows this is also the case in the UK and the US. And this may have kind of changed the way and the position of social democrats in the political landscape. So I think these are very important questions that there will be a lot of debate in the future about it, and I hope that my research has kind of convinced you that social democracy or the loss of social democratic votes is something that we need to study more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor ZWEIMELLER, for this very comprehensive presentation. I have some very interesting questions already. So don't hesitate to send me others. There is this the kind lady who's collecting the questions in the orange T-shirt. Potete anche scrivere in italiano, non ci sono problemi. One question linked directly to your presentation is, if the Social Democrats lost more votes than the right wing gained, so where did these difference of votes go? Did some people stop voting? Did some vote other parties like Greens or others? Did you study this?
We have not yet very closely looked at that question, but first of all, the narrative that, can you hear me? Yeah. The narrative that what's going on here is that the gains of the right-wing votes is kind of equal to the losses of the establishment. This does not seem to be true over the last 10 years. Okay, this is very clearly this. The losses of the Social Democrats were substantially larger than the gains of the right-wing parties. So the question is what has been changing over this last 10 to 15 years. I don't think that the gains of the Green parties are so important. The Green parties have gained a lot of support in the very recent elections, but if you go a couple of years back, then voting support for the Greens has not been that dramatic. There was a shift also towards partly towards conservative and liberal parties. One example would be the Austrian case. Okay? Recently, the Austrian Conservative Parties has changed the party leader, and the guy was pretty successful and has gained all the votes since he came into power. And this actually, there's a lot of divergence across countries, and probably the patterns are not as clear.
Next question is, immigration is a phenomenon of which is long-term and cannot be blocked. So does this lead to the conclusion that also for long-term we will be governed by the right wing?
Hopefully not. So, I guess an important question is how do we cope with immigration? And do we find policies and integration policies that, on the one hand, includes immigrants into the country, and on the other hand, makes natives not feel treated worse than immigrants? Okay, so much of the anti-immigration sentiment, as if I talk to friends and other people, many people perceive that immigrants, when they come to the country, they get access to social insurance benefits. And especially if you know somebody or have maybe experienced yourself that it is kind of complicated to get access to these benefits, then you don't understand this. And these are stories that people tell each other. And it suffices to have a few stories to have a lot of anti-immigration sentiment coming with that. But to answer the question whether the kind of non-right-wing, non-anti-immigration parties will be able to cope with immigration will depend a lot whether they can come up with policies that are able to address the problems arising coming with immigration.
There is another question I find very interesting, that maybe it's not only the question of Chinese imports, but that are reducing the share of manufacturing, but there's also automation, for example. There is also artificial intelligence. Will this have the same influence on on a loss of social democratic vote and the rise of the right?
Actually, there is, I think in a parallel session, there was a presentation about exactly this question. I mentioned the two Italian political scientists, Calantone and Stanik, who actually did also research on automation together with Massimo Anelli from Bocconi. And they actually find that right-wing support is driven by automation. Okay, so again, the identification strategy is to compare locations where there is a lot of implementation of automation technologies compared to other locations where this is not, and they find increasing support for right-wing parties in automation locations. So I think this is, again, it's not only globalization, it's also technology that affects the labor market outcomes of workers differentially, especially that brings low-skilled workers under pressure, and also technological trends may be contributing to the voting trends that we see recently. Yeah.
So let me put a few questions to you as a journalist, asking to you to see the wider picture as the economist. If we go back to the 90s, and if I remember first May demonstrations and speeches of trade unionists, they said the world is unjust. There's so many people who have less salary in the third world and they don't have industry, and this is all unjust. But does this now backfire onto those people who has been identifying the point that the world, the distribution of riches in the world and of labor on manufacturing was not equal, but now it seems as if the Western world had some privilege until the 90s. They had manufacturing jobs that were very well paid because others did not have manufacturing. Is that a privilege that we are now losing, and so that is now backfiring on social democrats?
Yeah, I think the part of the problem of the decline of the manufacturing sector, or put differently, the decline of the manufacturing sector doesn't need to be a problem per se. The problem arises because if workers lose a job in the manufacturing sector, they do not find a job of equal pay or equal quality in the services sector. Okay? There is, of course, a lot of structural change going on, and for instance, the US study by Autodorn and Hansen has shown is that the losses of workers in the manufacturing sectors are not compensated by gains in wage gains in the services sector, and they also find that actually many workers draw unemployment benefits or disability benefits in the US, yeah? And they kind of lose attachment to the labor force, and the problem of the problem of this structural change driven by the globalization process arises because rich economies do not manage to bring these workers into equally well-paid jobs. And in this sense, I think it's true that many workers actually have lost the privilege of being a well-paid manufacturing worker, and then they lost a job and did not find something of equal quality later on.
But maybe there is something that is a long-term goal of ammunition, of what international economists say. You must be competitive, you must be productive, and you must invest in education and in qualification. Maybe this is a very long-term goal, so it maybe loses out. Because if you have low-paid, low-qualified workers who lose out against immigration, one question could be to qualify them, to invest more in qualification. So very interesting news from Italy is that Italy has a very big sector of premium products, and they just this week had a presentation saying that in the next years we will need more than 200,000 qualified employees, but we don't find them. So these are the luxury companies who are able to pay more and who are able to employ well-paid, well-qualified people, but they don't find them.
Well, I think this is certainly a problem, but I would say the problem that we face on the labor market is not a labor demand problem in the sense that firms don't find the necessary workers. It's the main problem is that many workers don't find adequate jobs. And the education system is of course very important to help workers to find adequate jobs. And it could also be, and would be actually an interesting question to study, whether differential education systems affect these outcomes, these long-run outcomes differentially. For instance, what I have in mind is the country where I'm currently working on is Switzerland. Switzerland has invested a lot in education and has been able to cope with many big problems like the financial crisis or the huge appreciation of the Swiss franc or the disproportionately large immigration. And Switzerland was able to kind of to be among the lowest unemployment countries in Europe and also have very low wage inequality. So somehow Switzerland has managed to have a relatively equal distribution of skills at the bottom of the skill distribution. And I think this is very important if you think about also about kind of the dissatisfaction and voting outcomes of the low skill.
So there's just a question on this regarding to Switzerland. What was the effect of immigration on the four-party system in Switzerland?
In Switzerland, we have the Swiss People's Party. This is classified here as a right-wing party. Probably they are less radical than other right-wing parties, and have been a kind of part of the political landscape already before the 1980s, when there was the switch towards anti-immigration policies in this party. But Switzerland is a special case in the sense that many at least important voting decisions are made in referenda. And this direct democratic system is kind of creates a lot of inertia because it takes a long time until the decisions have been made. But it's also like a Damocles sword for politicians. It puts a lot of discipline on politicians. So because your career may be just destroyed if you kind of advocate something that eventually the voters reject in a subsequent referendum. And so, yes.
How come that Social Democrats missed the development? Because they could have seen earlier is an interesting question. How could they just stay with their opinions and with their policies and let it happen?
I'm not sure whether I have a good answer to this question. I can just, something that what I think without, having in a qualified way thought about this or having done research on my own. But so what I just perceive when I talk to people in the Social Democratic Party, I mean, there are a lot of traditions in that parties and how kind of the power within the parties is divided, and kind of that people with new ideas may have more problems to convince the entire or change the party direction than this is in younger parties. I don't know, but.
Is there also a tendency for shifts within social policy? So does the shift mean a shift from the Social Democrats to right-wing parties also include a shift from money of welfare for the working generation to pensions? So I think this question implies that maybe right-wing workers are older.
Yeah, this is probably certain. I would guess this is the case. So for me, it's kind of hard to make a clear statement. I think if I remember the Austrian case, for instance. So in Austria, it's older workers that support the Social Democrats, and increasingly younger workers that vote for or prime age workers that vote for the right-wing parties. To the extent this is the case also in other countries, which could be, then the demographic, there's important demographic dimension behind this voting support.
So another interesting question there was about the crisis. We had an economic crisis, and that had some effects on the unemployment in general. So would these electoral moves have happened if there would not have been this economic crisis, which was not caused by immigration, but had other reasons? But did this have an independent effect?
This is actually something we want to study in more detail. If you just look at the time series data, then you see that after 2008, manufacturing decline has speeded up, and this coincided with loss of voters for right-wing parties. So this there seems something in the data that is kind of an order of magnitude larger than the other data points. So after 2008, 2009, 2010.
If you look at Germany, you have these eastern German regions like Brandenburg and Saxony, where the right wing has gained the position of the most voted party, relative majority in the sense, in the area which has little immigration, and compared to 15, 20 years ago, relative economic success. Well, they have some pockets of unemployment, but Germany has been in a discussion for its economic surplus, so it's suffering less than others from Chinese imports. How come that in such an area you have gains of right wing?
You said Saxony?
Saxony and Brandenburg.
Eastern Germany. So I think it is important here, and this will be we want to do in the future, is to look at Western Europe, because I think in Eastern Europe it's different. Social democracy in Eastern Europe grew out of the former Communist Party, so they have a different background, and maybe voting behavior is kind of different. So this would also be, of course, the case if you look at other Eastern European countries. And this is why we decided to look at Western Europe. Okay? Now, of course, in Eastern Germany, so what we see is kind of a very, very strong anti-immigration sentiment, despite the fact that there are very few immigrants there. Okay? Also, this is a situation that you have also in many other Eastern European countries, like Slovakia or the Czech Republic. They talk a lot about, in the election campaigns, about immigration, although there are almost any immigrants in the country. And so this is kind of, we do not tackle this in our research project, but this is, of course, something to say. This is to say that the relationship in Eastern European countries with the different economic history, the different political history of these countries, and the lack of democratic experience, of course, at the same time may kind of generate a voting behavior that is not directly comparable to what we see in Western Europe, especially if you talk about social support for social democracy.
Let's come to a final evaluation. If you were to give an advice to a social democratic politician in Western Europe, would it be interesting to say something like, yes, you must keep reforming for more productive and competitive economy, for having better educated local workers who are then able to gain higher wages and have access to a segment of the labor market which is more qualified and which has less competition from immigrants? Is that a solution? Is that the solution, or are there other solutions? Is there no solution?
Well, I'm not a politician, so I don't really... But I think education is a key question, and kind of making sure that the potential losers from the globalization process have the chance to kind of retrain or get qualifications that makes them fit for the labor market. I think this is something very important. But I think also that this is not only about education, not only about the labor market. It's also very much about bringing people together and kind of design integration policies or foster integration at the local level that increases interaction between natives and immigrants. This is, for instance, think about housing. If housing is very concentrated in the ethnic dimension, then there will not be much interaction. Okay? Or think about schools. Yeah? Are kids distributed, immigrant kids distributed equally across schools, or are some native kids that have more than 50% of immigrant kids that don't speak the native language? Yeah? This is something that you hear in certain locations. This is a big problem, and I think these issues need to be tackled. And here, I think the Social Democrats would have kind of an area where they could improve, probably.
So thank you for your questions. Thank you for our young assistant in our hall, and thank you, Professor ZWEIMELLER. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.